Hey everyone, Ross Marchand here, Director of Policy for the Taxpayers Protection Alliance. Now, I know that all of you are probably super bored working from home, but I have good news. We're about to do an in-depth examination of FDA and healthcare policies across the country with Goldwater Institute's very own Naomi Lopez. Naomi, how are you doing today?
Doing great. Thank you. Thank you for having me as your guest today.
Absolutely. Oh, thanks for taking part. Had a lot of questions, and there's so much going on right now with the Food and Drug Administration and right to try and expanded access, and the media is throwing around all these terms. So, first of all, from the perspective of a patient, right, from the perspective of someone who's recently diagnosed with COVID-19, what is right to try? How could right to try help people out?
Well, let's start with the fact that there are no FDA approved treatments or vaccines for COVID-19 today. None.
Mm-hmm.
There are some in the pipeline. There are some
Mm-hmm.
treatments that may be repurposed to treat it. And there are some, and there are pharmaceutical companies that are scouring their libraries of previous trials to see if something might work. So let's start there. There are no FDA approved treatments.
Mm-hmm.
So what Right to Try does is it allows a patient who's facing a life-threatening illness,
Mm-hmm.
when their physician is recommending a treatment that is still under FDA clinical review and has passed phase 1, which is basic safety testing, to
Sure.
approach a manufacturer to obtain the treatment. No one is compelled to participate, not the patient, not the doctor, and not the manufacturer. But if all three agree that they want to proceed with something that has passed phase 1, which is basic safety, and that treatment remains under clinical investigation, in other words, there's not a hold on it, it hasn't been shuttered for some reason, that they are able to proceed without begging the federal government for permission to move forward.
Right. And you hear so much over the past 2 or 3 weeks about promising drugs. Remdesivir, I hope I pronounced that right,
Yes.
um, chloroquine. And
Yes.
patients are wondering, they want more information about those drugs. So does Right to Try apply to those drugs? And how are patients and doctors trying to get their hands on those promising medications?
So Right to Try does not apply to chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine. Those are FDA approved already. They've been
Mm-hmm.
around for decades to treat malaria, lupus, rheumatoid arthritis. So those are already legal and they're available today. What's basically the question today is whether or not that chemical compound might help with some of the symptoms of COVID-19. There have been some very small clinical trials in China and Europe that may indicate that they're promising, but we really don't know if they're effective, if they
Mm-hmm.
are effective, for whom they're effective, and at what stage of the illness progression they might be effective. So it is perfectly legal to prescribe a treatment off label. That is common if your child has ever had an ear infection and had to go on amoxicillin. That's not FDA approved for children, so that's off label. And if you are facing a life-threatening cancer diagnosis and you've failed other treatments, a lot of times the physicians will prescribe a cancer treatment off label because they believe it might be effective.
Mm-hmm.
So even though that is perfectly legal, there are FDA gag rules that prevent a manufacturer from talking about the truthful and scientific information about potential off-label treatments. The Goldwater Institute has been working on this issue for more than 2 years now, and we have passed legislation in both Arizona and Tennessee to protect that very important speech right on the part of manufacturers to share that information. So today, there is a clinical trial of chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine taking place in the US. It's an FDA-approved trial. It's starting out in New York, and that information will be shared with the FDA to hopefully provide more insights into the efficacy of that treatment, and also if there are any adverse events, if it proves to be toxic for some patients, for example. So that is going on right now, and over the weekend, the Food and Drug Administration issued an emergency authorization, which basically allows the release of chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine from the nation's stockpile.
Mm-hmm.
That there are tens of millions of doses being donated to the stockpile on the part of manufacturers, and those doses will be released to public health authorities around the country. The infrastructure is not in place today to collect data on the outcomes for those patients, but in taking those treatments, hospitals have to agree that they will in fact provide information about any adverse events. If, let's say that there's a negative outcome for a patient as a result of that treatment, or at a later date, whenever they are able to collect and make that data actionable, that they will share the outcomes data for the patients that they have treated. So that is one avenue. And keep in mind right now, since there is no treatment, there's no FDA approved treatment, there's nothing that's been proven to be effective, you really have a lot of people working around the clock trying to find ways to help through treatments. So remdesivir was a treatment that was under clinical trial for Ebola. It turned out not to be particularly effective and was abandoned. But because the scientists thought that it might be helpful, they brought it back out to treat some patients. And there have been trials going on in China and now the US as well. That treatment was made available under what's called expanded access. It's a basically compassionate use. It is through the FDA process where a physician will apply to the FDA to provide that treatment outside of clinical trials to a patient whose life hangs in the balance. So that's being used. That is being expanded to something called expanded access, where they're making that available to more patients who are more severely ill. We'll see what happens with that treatment. Hopefully it will continue to be effective. And you've also got, I'm hearing from companies around the country that are moving towards trying to make their products, their investigational products, available either through compassionate use or through right to try. We are going to see, I think, an enormous demand for these treatments that don't have an FDA green light. It could be many months, or it could even be many years before they obtain final approval. The big controversy for some people is that it's not proven effective. It's not proven yet. We don't know. Well, of course we don't know.
Yeah.
There is nothing proven. And the question, this is a really important question. Should people have access? Should they be allowed to take treatments that they don't know if it's going to work? I think that in this particular case, we're facing a pandemic. There's no approved treatments. This is really a question of medical autonomy. If a physician believes that it is the right treatment, that it might be helpful, and there's informed consent, then of course, you really have to allow this approach if all the parties agree that it's a reasonable approach and it's one that might be helpful to the patient.
Sure. And I think, or at least I would hope, that there's widespread agreement that patients need these drugs in the here and now, even before the FDA could formally green light it. But of course, there is that clinical trial process where the FDA is still formally examining it. There is still that formal framework, even if patients are going outside of the framework right now. So what can the FDA do within that framework to make sure that we're speeding along the clinical trial process as fast as possible while making sure that it's still a rigorous process?
Well, there still is a rigorous process in place, and it's something that we value very highly. We have a very rigorous and scientific approach to drug approval that examines both safety and efficacy. In the past, it has been an extraordinarily slow process. It's very expensive. You have a lot of drugs that don't reach the finish line, not because they're not efficacious, but because it is such a long and expensive process. I think that we will be looking in the near future at things like provisional approvals that occur earlier. Once safety is established, once there is a reason to believe that it might be efficacious, that you might have a conditional approval based on further study. But I think this is going to be, the direction that we will need to go in, particularly when we're addressing pandemics or rare diseases where there aren't treatments available to those patients. Unfortunately, in so many cases, you have a patient who is not going to qualify for a clinical trial. Perhaps they've taken a medication that excludes them. Perhaps they live too far away from the clinical trial location. There are a lot of reasons why a person may not qualify for a clinical trial, but I do need to point out that for chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine, using the national stockpile, using those doses that are provided under this emergency authorization, they are only for people who don't or are unable to participate in a clinical trial. So we still see that that structure is still in place. It still works in tandem with the FDA approval process. In other words, you're not pulling people from clinical trials, you're making it available to people who cannot otherwise participate.
Right.
And that holds true. That holds true for compassionate use. It holds true for right to try. All of these avenues work in tandem with the FDA approval process. No one is being pulled away from clinical trials, which are important and necessary and really do, that's really where the scientific evidence comes into play.
Right. And I think that we can both agree that we need both. We need options for patients who are really sick, who do not qualify for clinical trials. And at the same time, we do need that continued clinical trial process. So where can we read more about this? Goldwater Institute have a website that is devoted specifically to Right to Try, or just the website in general?
So we do have a website called righttotry.org, and that has information on Right to Try. But the Goldwater Institute is providing daily dedicated coverage to the coronavirus crisis, and you can go to goldwaterinstitute.org to our homepage and you will see it. We are covering this pandemic from a variety of angles, whether it be from home-based businesses and the regulations that are particularly important to remove today, now that so many people have to work from home, to things like the emergency authorization and how investigational treatments are being used in the pandemic. And so it is very timely information. No one else has the deep bench of expertise in this broad range of areas that the coronavirus is impacting in our daily lives now. This really goes to show just how important and why good policy is now more important than ever. Right.
And this is all extremely timely, and it seems like things, especially at the FDA regulatory level, are changing every day. So I think that those resources are super important, and you could look at our work, Taxpayers Protection Alliance, at our website, protectingtaxpayers.org. Well, thank you so much, Naomi.
Thank you so much.
Take care.